Hi there everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video we'll be talking about retention policies within the Business Central environment. So what is a retention policy to begin with? Well, it's basically a feature within Business Central that we can use to remove sets or certain sets of data within the BC environment. So these sets of data normally belong to tables which perhaps track entries or sort of those sorts of tables that we can safely remove data from. If we don't, the data will pile up in those tables over a long period of time and may take up more storage in our database than we want. So it's quite important, especially if you're in an online environment where we do have environment storage limits. So definitely do have a think about playing with retention policies, maybe in your sandbox environments first, just getting comfortable with them, and then maybe putting them live in your production environments. So let's get into it. Well, what I'm going to do first here is just search for a page called retention policies. Okay, so what we have on here on this page is basically just a list of all of the retention policies which you have in this particular environment. Okay, so if I go into one of these records, so these are just the ones that have been set up sort of out of the box, and as you can see, I've got my change log entry, I've got my retention policy log entry, because you do have retention policy logs. We'll run through that in a second, but we also have things like the integration synchronization job, so the integration with CE that causes sort of tables to get populated, and this job can clear those down. We've got the same here specifically regarding errors on the integration synchronization job, and I won't run through them all here, guys, but you get the idea. I mean, these are sort of those log entry type tables where data can grow pretty quickly, pretty fast, and it's just about setting up sensible retention periods on those. Okay, now if I jump into one of these here, so I just go into the change log entry retention policy. What we've got is a little bit of setup that we can do here. Okay, so first things first, we can select a table ID in the general fast tab area here. Okay, so the changelog entry is a table name, table caption is changelog entry as well, and they are selected as they are in these fields because I've got table ID 405, okay, selected here. So if I drill down into here, I can see a full list of all the tables on which I can set up retention policies. So these are the ones that you get out of the box, but there are ways in which you can add your own bespoke tables into this list as well. So I think there's some things that you can do with Visual Studio when you're developing your extension that you can add to your code to enable us to select your table in this particular list. But you can see here it's a subset of the tables that we have within the Business Central environment, and I think you'll agree all of these are fairly sensible tables on which we might want to set up a retention policy. Okay, so first things first, we select our table ID. Okay, so what we can do then is we can set up the retention policy, and here we can say is the retention policy manual or not? Okay, so basically this is saying we can only run this retention policy manually, or if I untick it like this, I can run that on the job queue. Okay, so the tooltip set tells us the same there, specifies where the retention policy can only be run manually. Okay, so I can also enable or disable a retention policy. Okay, so for whatever reason, maybe when we're first setting it up, or if we're still having a play with it, or if we later decide that it doesn't need to be enabled, we can enable or disable the retention policy here. Okay, so the apply to all records, so this one's quite important. If I try and enable that on this particular retention policy, I get an error message here, so it tells me, and we just highlight that again, you cannot toggle apply to all records because the retention policy for table 405 changelog contains mandatory filters. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, basically what we can do in the background, what has been done on some tables, is mandatory filters have been set up. Right now, this means that there are some mandatory filters applied to the retention policy of the changelog entry table, which means that I cannot delete all records from a table using a retention policy. Okay, now what are those mandatory rules? Well, they are in the record retention policy down here. So you can see here I've got a filter where protected is equal to yes. Okay, now you can see I cannot choose I cannot unselect, the enabled and locked fields here. So I can't change those, okay? They are defined by the system and I can't modify those. And equally, I've got another one here, field log entry feature, monitor sensitive fields, all, again, this particular filter is enabled and locked and I can't change that, right? So I can't click on that. So we've got another one here where protected is equal to no, and I can change this one here. Look, so I can drill in and I can put a filter on my change log entry table, and I can see where protected is equal to no is used on this particular filter entry, and here I can enable or disable this. And equally, if I wanted to, I could go in and add my own filters in there, right? So if I didn't want those entries linked to a particular table to be deleted, I could add specific filters in around that to keep those for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time than the rest, right? So it's pretty clever how we can set those up. It's quite flexible. Okay, so the records to delete here basically shows us how many records will be deleted the next time that the retention policy runs. And then we've got a few fields here that basically just tell us, how do we know what field is it that we use to determine the date field that basically controls which entries are deleted. Okay, so on the changelog entry table 405, it's the date field number 20001, and it's the field name and field caption created at. So it's the created at field on the changelog entries table which we are using to determine the date that entry goes into the system. And therefore, what's the retention policy, 1 year, 28 days, 1 year, etc. And that is what will control when those entries are deleted. Okay, so a few of the things up at the top here, we can choose to apply manually. So I can go here, I can click apply manually, and it says, do you want to delete expired data as defined in the selected retention policy? Okay, so this is basically just saying, I want to run this retention policy manually. And from here, I can click yes or no, and it will delete or not delete those expired data sets in the changelog entry table. Okay, so other things that we can do here is we can set up a job queue entry. So the moment that we set up a retention policy to be run on the job queue, it's going to create a job queue entry, which is this one here, the retention policy job queue, and that is basically going to be used to clear all entries based on the retention policies that we have on our environment. Okay, so we can also set up retention periods. So this is a table on which I can set up the different retention periods that we have on this particular environment. So we've got a few here, and you can see I can't define the retention period calculation myself here, but if I go in and add one that is not in this table already, so 3 years, you see it adds the retention period calculation and the expiration date, expiry date here in this field. And then I can add a code here if I want to as well. So 3 months, just like this, okay? So these are the retention periods that we can then use in the record retention policy retention period column here, okay? So then we also have the retention policy log, which is basically telling us when did this run and what did we see when it ran. Okay, so here it's giving us a few messages. You can see it's running, and it's basically giving us an overview of what happened. Okay, so it's sort of like the job queue log entries table. It's just giving us an idea of what happened when that job ran. Okay, and this table, if we go back to our, if we go back to our retention policies, you can see here that the retention policy log entry table is also on the retention policies, so you can clear those down after a period of time. See, the recommended here is 6 months, but you can go in and review and maybe add, maybe change those here. So see, this one has got a little bit of a different setup, but we can change the retention period here to 1 week, 28 days, 3 months, as we see fit, and that will clear down the retention policy log entry as defined in the table ID here. Okay, so these are the retention policies, guys, and that is how we would use them. Just one other thing, I guess, when we're running it on the job queue, so if I just run back to my job queue entries, we need to make sure that the user who is running that particular job queue entry has permissions to delete the records that we're trying to delete in that retention policy, obviously, otherwise it will error. So I think it's probably best to give the user that's running this job queue entry super permissions, right? I mean, you might have a particular user that you use to run your job queue entries. I guess it depends on sort of how you work, but just a consideration there when you're setting up those retention policies to run on the job queue. Okay, so that is everything that I wanted to run through on retention policies. I hope you guys found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.